We have a special treat today because our speaker is David Van Slyke, the Dean of the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs and the Louis A. Bantle Chair in Business Government Policy in the Department of Public Administration and International Affairs. He is an internationally renowned scholar of public-private partnerships, which is the subject of his lecture today. And he has worked all over the world, including in China, India, Japan, Kazakhstan, Korea, the Netherlands, Peru, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, Thailand, the United Kingdom, and Uzbekistan. In the US, he has advised the Office of Management and Budget, the Government Accountability Office, the US Coast Guard, and the Department of Defense, among others. As I said, his lecture will also feature a surprise guest who he will introduce when it's time. Dean Van Slyke, welcome.
Thank you, Professor Faulkner. I'm delighted to be here today. I want to talk with you about a topic that maybe some people think, USA at 250? What's this whole thing about partnerships? But I want to sort of tell you about this tradition that really stems from before the country was founded. And I want to lead you through, I'm a case teacher, so I want to lead you through a couple of cases and set you up. And then as Professor Faulkner said, we have a special guest near the end of the presentation. So when we think about the founding of our country, it's pretty amazing when you think that we're at 250 years. And yet on the other hand, when our founders were involved in the establishment of the nation, right, we didn't have a king, because we were looking to get away from that kind of approach, right? We were looking to set up something that is still somewhat unusual, and that is a democratic and republican form of government. Democratic, right? You and I had the ability to vote. Republican in the sense that we elect representatives. And here, one of the great political scientists of our time, Alexis de Tocqueville, a French political scientist, philosopher, and observer of what he called the American experiment, was really focused on the fact that Americans create associations for all kinds of things: social, legal, cultural, political, religious. And yet, what we're going to talk about is a different form of association today, the ways in which our government has actually engaged both many other forms of governments, federal, state, and local, nonprofit organizations, and private organizations. And that's part of what makes this country's approach a bit different than other countries. So here's kind of a roadmap for where we're going to go today. I'm going to help establish a framework. What do I mean by public-private partnerships? I'm going to help to show a little bit of that historical evolution. What's actually happened over time? Why did it happen? What were the benefits? Were there some things that didn't quite work out the way that we thought? And then I'm going to lead you through a couple of cases. And some of those cases you're going to be able to relate to very real time. And then we'll have kind of a wrap up, and then we're going to go to our interview. Someone who's a real subject matter expert on this and actually does this every day as part of their work. But first, let's just talk about, what do we actually mean when we talk about a public-private partnership? What we really mean is actually bringing different types of organizations together. What are the things that they have that maybe government doesn't have? And then how do we actually wrap that together? And it's in that bringing together that we often use things called contracts. And every one of you has had an experience with a contract, whether it's financial aid, whether it was maybe buying a car, whether it was renting a car, whether it was the lease for your apartment. We have all been involved in contracts because contracts basically tell us, here's what we're going to agree to in exchange for something. And what that means is that we often have to think about both risks and rewards. Now, there are three things that really differentiate what a public-private partnership is: ownership, structure, and risk. So when we think about any kind of partnership, and I'm going to show you some different types, the big question is, who owns it? And what do we mean by own? I mean, literally, who owns it? Like maybe the car that you've had or your family's had or a house that you've had or anything that you've owned yourself. Do you own it forever or do you only own it for part of the time? How did you actually structure the arrangement? What were the kind of trade-offs? What was underlying that contract? And then what are some of the risks? One thing we're going to talk about all throughout this class is risk allocation. What's in our interest to take on, and why would we engage someone else to do something? Is it because we can't do it? They have certain kinds of expertise. Maybe they have some other experience. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. But I want to give you some context. How many of you have ever heard of this term public-private partnership before? I see 3.5 hands. Okay, so 3.5 hands out of 23 people, 20 of you have never heard of this before. And part of the reason that we talk about these public-private partnerships, both domestically and internationally, right, is that there's a demand for something. So as Professor Faulkner said, I've worked in both developed and developing countries. Probably the country I've spent the most time in is India. India needs everything: roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, train systems, airports, airport facilities, ports, and cargo. And the government only has so much money that it can actually allocate across those 38 states in India and what it's going to invest in. And what it does is it begins to look for other partners, partners who can actually build that stuff, partners who can actually operate that stuff, partners who can put up the financing for those kinds of projects. So part of the context for this is we often need things, right? We, the people, we, governments, we, nations need something, right? And in that need, we go looking for, how do we do it? Who do we do it with? Under what conditions would we do it? And with what set of resources? And so part of the reason that public-private partnerships are so common across the world is that globally, we need just under 94 trillion. You heard that correctly, a T, $94 trillion of infrastructure investment is needed globally in the next 15 years. Like, I don't know about you, how many zeros are a trillion, right? It's a lot, right? And so the point here is these become tools that governments begin to use to really ask themselves, how are we doing, right? And how do we do this? So there's very simple kinds of partnerships. Hey, let's get together. This is mostly voluntary. You and I both want to do this, and yet you have a certain kind of expertise and I have a certain kind of expertise. That's one kind of partnership. A second kind of partnership is something that looks more contractually, right? I have a particular kind of expertise, you don't. You want to hire me to do something for you, and I do it. And we work out the terms of that exchange. But the last one is where things are a bit more complicated. Maybe they're more complex. Maybe I have an interest. There are things I could do. It's in the public interest, but I need you to participate. And I need you to participate in certain ways. And some of those certain ways may be the capital that you put up, but some of it may be your expertise and your experience doing things. I'm not likely to want to hire people who have never done something before for the first time, especially if it's very complex. So I'm looking to draw on what that expertise and that experience is going to look like. But for me, I'm always thinking about, right, maybe not surprisingly, as the dean of the Maxwell School, how does government benefit? And it's not just how does government benefit, how do you, citizens, benefit? And if you're not benefiting, then maybe we're using the wrong tool, or maybe we haven't structured this the right way. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So some of the motivations I've talked about, right? How to leverage expertise, how to be able to draw in capital, right? How to think about creating the right incentives for organizations to take some risks and innovate, especially if there's some benefit in it for them. But there are some concerns too. How many of you have ever heard the word optimism bias? One person, two, kind of. Optimism bias is when we think everything's going to work out often much better than it does, right? We often think that, oh, this will be perfect. And some things for us turn out to be perfect in life, but a lot of things turn out to be a little bit different, right? The more complex the project or the service that you're trying to do, the harder it is to measure, the harder it is to observe, the more difficulty you have specifying what you expect something to be in terms of outcomes, the more challenging it's going to be. And the more challenging something is, the more it requires both leadership, but it requires being able to leverage some of those other kinds of expertise. And sometimes we don't do that very well. We just tend to think, oh, this is going to work out just fine. So where are these kind of partnerships being used? They're being used everywhere for everything. The building of schools and hospitals and libraries, we might call that social infrastructure. In terms of physical infrastructure, we might be thinking about airports and deep ports and telecommunication systems and energy systems. So the point is, I'm telling you about a type of tool that governments all around the world use, but they use it for lots of big things. And I actually worked on this system here. This is the light rail subway system in Bangkok, Thailand, that basically takes one of the most congested cities in the world and tries to actually reduce some congestion with it. But that gives you a little bit of sense of what we mean when we talk about partnerships, public-private partnerships. The public side, government, the private side, some other set of entities, and what we're trying to do, what we're trying to produce. But when we think about this, let's go back to our foundings, right? Because this whole class, right, is about the US at 250. And our founding fathers, President Washington, Treasury Secretary Hamilton, you know, at the Constitutional Convention, at the founding, in writing the Declaration of Independence, what they realized is there's a lot of things we can't do in setting up this country. We've got a series of colonies, some of which actually don't want to be part of a unified republic. How do we set up a banking system? And how do we account for some of the debts that those states are going to have as they come into the union, so to speak? How do we actually create commerce? Commerce that might generate revenue. Is that through canals? Is that through roads? And so here, when we think about some of these historical figures that every one of you knows, Washington and Hamilton, and some that you may be less familiar with, Gallatin and Clay, one of the things that they're talking about is how do we actually set up a government that can actually work for the people when in fact we have to create almost everything now as a framework for how to govern what happens in this country. And to me, that's really exciting because the founding of many other countries, there may be a set of values that fundamentally undergird what those countries are about. And we think of that in some ways as our Declaration of Independence, right? But when you look at a lot of our historical documents, they don't point to a king or a monarch. They don't point to an existing government. They point to, right, the need to draw on other forms of organizations. And that fundamentally makes us so different than many other countries. Now, when we begin to think about these, there's a long history in which these have evolved, right? And we'll talk about some of these cases like the Erie Canal and the Transcontinental Railroad. But the amazing thing about the United States, right, is that if you create the right foundation, people will see opportunities. And people, if they think the rewards equal the risks, or actually the rewards are greater than the risks, they'll try to do something. They'll try to do something new. They'll try to meet a need. They'll try to innovate. And it's in that innovation that's part of what makes the American experiment so incredible, is thinking about where are those forms of innovation? What are those projects? So if we think about the Erie Canal, one of the things I love about this is in our backyard. It was really a question. How do we link the Hudson River and Lake Erie? There was no commerce happening in the Midwest. Anyone here from the Midwest? No one? So interesting, no commerce happening at all. But this was an effort that actually led to New York City being the most active port in the nation. Now, this 363-mile stretch here from the Hudson River all the way to Lake Erie, what was amazing about this is the government put up some of the land all across the segments in which the Erie Canal was built. They were all performance-based contracts. Do you know what the term performance-based means? It means you can observe the outcomes of what was happening. We need to dig a canal. It needs to be so many feet deep. It needs to be so many feet wide. It needs to be able to handle so much water. It needs to be able to transmit this amount of goods and people. That's pretty amazing, right? That's a performance-based contract because you're actually specifying a set of objectives that you can both observe and you can measure. But here it also employed people all across the state and the region. And one of the things that the government did is it put up a level of financing that today would be the equivalent of about $175 million in today's dollars. And so when we think about this, right, it's pretty powerful, and you've probably seen some of the pictures, but it's pretty powerful to begin to say, this was happening in our country. This was happening 40 years after independence. And to me, I think that's pretty exciting because it also led across the country to another 3,226 miles of canals that were built. This was a pilot. You know what the term pilot means? This was like a small-scale project that we were developing to see, can something actually happen from this, right? So pretty exciting from my perspective. But then there's something else happening. About 50 years later, right, we're saying it's one thing to float a small barge across the state, across the country. Now we want to figure out, as we've seen population shifts moving west, how do we move more cargo? How do we get it there? And here the federal government stepped up in a really significant way, dedicating hundreds of millions of acres of land, right, at the federal level and the state level. Government bonding, meaning government providing the financing that would be repaid, but created strong incentives for private industry, big companies, because there was no national rail company. Today, you see a train like CSX, but there was no CSX when we were thinking about creating we were trying to create trains and locomotives. But here, part of what we were doing is we were saying, how's this going to go across the country? And companies, private investors, entrepreneurs, risk takers were asking, what's in it for us? Because right now I make all my money by shipping stuff on a boat in a canal. Why would I want to invest in a railroad? Isn't a railroad going to make me less competitive? Isn't my economic interest going to be displaced? And part of what the United States federal government was doing is it was saying, you take on some of the risk, and we're going to give you the opportunity, right, where you're going to be able to develop whole new towns, villages, commerce. It's all going to be there along the rail system. And so from my perspective, what's interesting about this is you think about, how do you bring people together? How do you deploy labor? How do you deploy capital, but in the interests of the public? And this is what the Transcontinental Railroad really was. It was a partnership really focused on you and me. Well, we may not have thought that we were going to be beneficiaries of this, but we know right now everything we get has to travel from somewhere else. And the more efficient and therefore the lower priced that transportation is, the better it is for you and I in terms of paying less for something. Now, there's all kinds of other consequences, though, right, that we could talk about. No one was talking about climate change in 1863, but they were talking about how do we actually move things from east to west. Okay, so that was one form of partnerships. But then there was a whole other group of people who were actually not benefiting from our system of government. And they were having to ask themselves, are there other ways we can engage with one another when the federal government is not actually acting in our interest? Are there things that we can do in how we partner with one another, in how we bring money to bear on an issue, on what it is we're trying to achieve? And one of the things I find so interesting is there is something called the McKissick family, and they are 6 generations of Black architects, of an architectural firm founded by an enslaved bricklayer. And what they've done is they've built all around the country. And they've done this, though, often without the assistance of federal and state entities. And they've had to do it through lots of other forms of voluntary organization of how they actually engaged people and capital. And some of those are what today, if any of you have ever taken an economics class, might call a community development corporation or a community development financial institution. The idea of localized lending to people that sometimes we deem to be high risk, but we think that there's some reward and we want to invest in that. And that's what some of these organizations were doing from the founding, thinking about things, organizations like the Free African Society. Okay, so I've sort of given you this kind of from very simple, easy to specify, easy to measure, easy to observe, all the way down to some of these things are more complex that we do. And today, I don't know what most of you are majoring in, but if you think about some of the challenges that face our country today, one of the biggest challenges that faces our country is both education and poverty. And the two are highly linked, right? But when people are impoverished, it's not often that they simply lack economic resources. They may also lack food and housing and healthcare and transportation and job training. And so we're going to talk about some of those kinds of partnerships too, and those would fit closer to the bottom here, where things are more complex, where they're harder to scale certain kinds of projects. Okay, but when we talk about partnerships, right, there's often a model. The World Bank is the biggest organization that creates opportunities around the world. And some would argue also promotes or furthers or exacerbates certain kinds of inequities. But here what you can see is this is a framework that goes from very low risk, right? So where government retains a lot of the control to very much more higher risk and where the private sector has more control. And so one of the things that we often ask ourselves is, who bears the risk, over what period of time, and what are the expected benefits? And the expected benefits not only to we, the public, but the expected benefits to the firm that's taking on that level of risk. Now, when we do this, we have some great case studies, even in our own country, of where these partnerships have succeeded and where they failed. And I want to talk to you about 2 of them. The first one I want to talk to you about has been a real success. Anyone here from Miami? No one here from Miami. Okay, well, I'm batting 1,000 in my public polling of the class today. Miami had a lot of congestion over near the port facility. So if you've ever taken a cruise out of Miami, where the port facility is not always easy to get to because there's a lot of congestion in traffic. It's a real bottleneck. And what they did was they actually created a tunnel that went underneath the water to be able to divert a lot of that traffic. And what made this a success is that there was very clear specification of what the project was, a lot of money that the federal and state governments both put up. There was a real effort to solicit feedback from the public, and there was great risk allocation. In fact, the public and the private knew exactly what they were getting into. And when you think about this project, one of the things that's amazing to me is always about outcomes. What happened as a result of this? Not only did the project get done on time and under budget, but it actually saves the equivalent of 3,400 vehicle hours per day just on that one stretch of road. So if you think about that across 365 days, assuming same level of traffic per day, you're talking just significant savings of people's time. But when you reduce congestion, what's one of the benefits? Climate, the environment, right? You're not sitting there just continuing to emit, right? Well, that was a successful project. And you can see over on, the right-hand side what some of those were. But on the left-hand side, for you, is a different project called the Chicago parking meters. And what made that project probably the case study of failure among failures in the United States is that Mayor Daley was in need of a lot of cash. He had about a $400 million deficit when he was mayor. And he was looking around and basically asking the question of, how do I get more money? I can either tax citizens of Chicago more, residents of Chicago more. I can sell something, but what if I entered into a partnership for something? How could I raise the money up front? And what they decided to do was to basically go with a consortium from an investment firm, Morgan Stanley, backed by a German insurance company and an Abu Dhabi investment authority, right? And they basically said you can control 36,000 parking meters in the city of Chicago. Here's the challenge. There was no public involvement. So citizens, really, residents felt like, business owners all felt like their voice had not been heard. It was rushed through. Elected officials had less than 24 hours to review a more than 1,500-page document. And they sold it for $1 billion less than it was actually worth. Now, you might like it if you got something at a 50% discount. The residents of Chicago were not so excited to get something, to sell something into the future, a 75-year lease agreement. And so I don't know how old you all are, but how many of you think you're still going to be here in 75 years, right? Yeah, a couple of you are thinking, yeah, if I eat right and work out right, I'm still going to be here. I can guarantee you none of those political officials are going to be there in 75 years. And so every time that the city of Chicago wanted to close a street for a parade, they had to pay the company extra for all those parking meters that then weren't being used. How many of you go to and park in a place and maybe it's free before certain hours and free after certain hours? This changed to being charged 24 hours a day. How many of you have a physical disability and may need a vehicle that can put you closer to a place that you need to go? Here they reduce the number of spaces for handicap parking because those are often much larger spaces and they're wider spaces. So my point here is there was very little due diligence. There was not a lot of competition. And the challenge was that the city sold it for $1 billion less than they should have. So those are just two examples. Here, though, are kind of two very different examples that I want to talk about. And I'll be quick on this because I know we only have about another 10 or 15 minutes before our guest is going to join us. But here is one example, what's called Head Start. I hesitate to ask with another polling question how many of you have heard of Head Start, but Head Start is essentially a very traditional government nonprofit-oriented partnership. So the government puts up about a little over $12 billion a year. It works with about 1,600 nonprofit organizations, school districts, and other entities all around the country. And the whole notion is that if you intervene earlier with children, children will have much better lifetime outcomes in terms of health, in terms of literacy, in terms of staying in school, in terms of economic earning opportunities. And so this entire process of Head Start is one that goes between the federal government and local governments. And it's amazing because this is generally considered to be a successful program. Now, even though there are what people call fade out, meaning that the benefits only stay with you so long. There's some evidence that even kids who go through Head Start may lose some of those benefits by second grade. The big difference is in terms of level of motivation, in terms of literacy, early adoption in being in school, and that's connected to all other types of societal benefits. So Head Start is what we might call a very traditional form of partnership. But a much more innovative approach, right, is something that we call social impact bonds. And social impact bonds are the idea that unlike Head Start, right, where up on the top, you and I as taxpayers, we pay regardless of whether the program is successful or not. And maybe it's successful for some kids, and maybe it's not so successful for other kids. How many of you like to pay for things that actually don't work out the way you wanted them to work out? Most of us don't actually like that. Most of us want to hold on to our money. So is there another way of doing this? Maybe a more innovative way? And so this is a different kind of public-private partnership because essentially government works with private investors and says, we'll pay you, but only when you get successful outcomes. You'll put up all the money. And then if they achieve these agreed upon milestones, I'll pay you. But if they don't achieve those milestones, you're on the hook. You bear the risk. Now, I hope what you're thinking right now, though, is can you actually scale those kinds of models? Because it's one thing to have a tightly controlled group of people, as in the case of a very successful program in Utah. But if you begin to think about Head Start, what Head Start was doing is it's dealing with the most vulnerable populations in the country. And it's not just dealing with children who maybe are a bit delayed in terms of, how they adjust to learning. It may be that they're also, from environments where they have less stable homes, less reliable sources of nutrition. One of the concerns with social impact bonds is that how do you really ensure performance? How do you really ensure performance? How do you get the best outcomes? You change the selection model. You choose the students most likely to perform at a high level. So what do you think that means for all the students that aren't selected? What happens to them? Well, they get left behind, right? So my point here is, right, these models, these are tools. And no one tool is the right tool for every situation. Part of what you have to be focused on is how do I bring this tool to bear on the problem that I'm focused on right now? How do I create the right structures and the right incentives and the right risk transfer? Because we can always pick the best and the brightest. The best and brightest often distinguish themselves. We can tell even when they're small children, can't we? In terms of who's paying attention, who's engaged. But that's harder, right, when you have a more vulnerable population. And that's why these models differ a bit. Now, this one I suspect you've all heard about. This is Micron. This is a modern day Erie Canal for upstate New York. And this is 4 fabrication plants that really focus on manufacturing semiconductor chips. And that's a national security problem for the United States. But here, the federal government put up money, about $6.5 billion from something called the Federal CHIPS Act. The state of New York put up about $5.5 billion. There's estimated to be 9,000 employees that Micron then will work with directly, another 40,000 that then will be employed because of all these new businesses that will set up here because they'll be supplying Micron. But it's also because the local government began acquiring all this land for Micron to be actually able to put its facility. It was the fact that the state and the local government said, yeah, we'll figure out how to build a new water infrastructure for you. And it's also places like Syracuse that said, we'll play a role in research and development and upskilling, training people. And so I think this is pretty exciting because this is actually right in our backyard. The question is, will we see the payoff that we think we're going to see? Perhaps the most exciting partnership is the one you just witnessed last week, and this is Artemis. And this isn't, the mission from 1972. This mission is so different because NASA bears all the mission risk. It had to specify all the objectives. But the private sector bore all the risk around who was making what, whether it was Blue Origin or whether it's SpaceX, whether it's traditional companies like Lockheed Martin or Northrop Grumman. It was 61 international partners. It was the European Space Agency, the Canadian Space Agency, the Japanese Space Agency, the United Arab Emirates Space Agency. All of them wanted to be a part of this. And get a load of this, there were another 2,600 universities across the country that all played some role in this. This was the quintessential public-private partnership. Federal money, state money, local money, international money, private sector money, new forms of innovation. And I'm sure that some of you either watched the beginning when it took off, or you watched the landing upon re-entry, where there was so much controversy, right? And questions about the heat shield as they were coming back into the Earth's orbit. But to think about how that happened, and the only time we lost any communication was 40 minutes when it was on the dark side of the moon, right, is a pretty powerful way of thinking about harnessing technology and innovation. So I hope you walk away with already some sense of what makes these things a little better than others, and what are some of the factors that help facilitate the likelihood of a project being more successful or less successful, right? And some of that is about being clear and specifying the objectives. It's about competition, being able to get others to actually want to compete to be a part of this. Part of it is, what are the incentives? How do we transfer risk? And what are the capabilities that we need? This takes a lot of thinking about design. It takes a lot of engagement with others, with other stakeholders, with other kinds of interested parties. And what makes it so exciting is when you see one of these work, it's pretty amazing. I worked on a project in Mumbai where they expanded the airport, which was essentially looked like an X, just two runways. And it was amazing to think about the growth of Mumbai and to see that project further expand. And there were all kinds of issues with slum dwellers and impoverished pockets of the city, to thinking about all this new global commerce. But I've also been on projects and have observed them where a bridge across a ravine for a train goes halfway across and never makes it to the other side. It's never finished. And so these kind of partnerships are real, and you and I bear the costs of them. We can bear the success of them, but we can also bear the failures of them. And so when I think about the USA at 250, the theme of this course and all the amazing faculty that you've heard of, I mean, I hope you feel excited by it. You've had this kind of whirlwind that Professor Faulkner has put together for you, and it's still not enough time to really explore the US at 250 years. But I hope what you see is this is deeply American. Sometimes people say, well, how do we do this? This is how we do this. This is how we innovate. This is how we engage other organizations. Is it perfect? No. Is it always lead to optimal results? Not at all. But is this a tool that is sort of born in our values in a way that's different than other countries? Absolutely. And I think, from my perspective, Europe, this is for you. You're the generation I'm writing about. I think some of you will be involved in this. And the question is, what will you take to it to ensure that when Professor Faulkner and I are old, we're not paying a lot of money for projects that didn't work out, but we're celebrating some of these new successes. So governments, they got a lot of work to do. They need to think through, what should this PPP be? How do we address these kind of different infrastructure projects? How do we think about who the participants are and what the risk levels are? And how do we make sure that we get accountability? Okay, I want to tell you a little bit about our guest. I'm really excited that the chairman of the Board of Trustees for Syracuse University, Mr. Jeff Scruggs, is going to join us for a conversation. So Mr. Scruggs actually grew up at Syracuse University. His father was a really popular history professor. He did his undergraduate at Harvard in economics and his MBA at Harvard. He has worked in a number of organizations, but he has been the long-term head at Goldman Sachs of the Public Sector and Infrastructure Banking Group. He's been on the Maxwell Advisory Board and serves on the Board of Trustees and is its current chairman. And Jeff, I just want to say thank you so much in your busy schedule to making time for us. We're really delighted to have you here today. So Jeff, you know, you've had this long career, and I'll confess, I had dinner with Jeff several years ago, and Jeff made the topic of public finance and public infrastructure finance as exciting as I've ever heard anyone. Now, I know that sounds pretty nerdy, but what's that?
I said, that's pretty bad.
But maybe you can tell us, Jeff, a little bit. I mean, you've been in this industry for 30 plus years. What have you seen evolve, and what still draws you to this work?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, David. And, you know, I heard you earlier give, a slight exaggeration saying I'm a P3 expert. I would put that one on hold for a second. It's very fair to say that in the group that I managed for 17 years, we had a P3 component of the group and several folks that were really, really deep into it. And I'm probably a surface level, having seen a number of these things, but as you indicated, David, there's a complexity in the details of each one of these P3 transactions that can be numbing. It really is very complex to get it right from everybody's perspective. But just kind of backing up for a second, yes, I've been involved in the public finance industry, which is really projects primarily for U.S. domiciled entities, municipal government, state governments. It also does stretch to the territories, and at least in Goldman Sachs Group, we did a number of things that involve private sector parties overseas, but I won't get into those. Those are tangential, though some of them really relate to P3s broadly. The municipal finance industry, if you would have asked what it was in the mid-1980s when I first joined, and I'm sure people are doing the calculus, like, how old is this guy? If he's talking about having joined the mid-80s. Well, I was very young then. How about that? It was a different form of financing than takes place in some areas now. And David, we can obviously go through kind of what the stages were and what has led to some of the P3, I'll say, upswing that has occurred, particularly in the last 15 years or so. You gave a few examples that occurred in the early aughts, which kind of have led in some respect to what has occurred in the last 15 years. But if you go back before the year 2000, you're scratching your head for what you consider to be a P3. Now, I said what you consider to be a P3, and that may be a little unfair, but I'm going to point it out just for purposes of example. I can make a credible argument to you that most of the funding or most of the projects done in the municipal sector are P3s of some variety. Public-private partnerships, and I'm just looking back, I'm looking at my notes, but the three kind of areas that you outlined, ownership, structure, and risk, if you think about any sort of project that is funded in the municipal space, and whether that is road repair, whether that is building a new municipal building, whether it's building a convention center, a sports stadium, at some level, in all likelihood, the private sector is involved and they're taking some risk at some level. Now, that could be a guaranteed maximum price construction contract, or that could be some other form where they are putting their money up or putting some risk up. But that is not what is classically considered to be a P3, at least in current society. So we can explore some of that if you like, and there are a host of projects that I would point to that are kind of away from some of the projects that you outlined in the P3 space, but there are a bunch that you also outlined that I could expand on a little bit.
That sounds great. So Jeff, when you think about these kinds of P3s, are there certain elements that you think contribute to the success and that differentiate, more successful from less successful partnerships?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the first thing that jumps out at you is a successful P3 really has to work for all parties. And all parties being, in the instance that you're talking about, David, let's say it's the municipal sponsor or state sponsor, it's the private sector folks, and it's just anybody that's going to be, labor, et cetera, that's going to be helping run this. A good P3 arrangement offers excellent incentives for the private sector. So let's be honest, the private sector is profit driven here. And so if you structure a P3 properly so that the private sector makes money, the way that it will work best for the public sector is if the public sector gets extreme value, the more the private sector makes. Bad deals can be structured. I know you gave examples of one or two. I won't comment on those, but bad deals can be structured where it really favors one party or the other, and it becomes more apparent over time. That is probably what would be classically referred to as a bad deal. Good deal probably for one side, but not a good deal for another. So it's not a win-win, if you will. If you're looking at the public side, I think there's a feeling, sometimes I think it's misguided, that, the public sector is not going to be able to keep up. The private sector is going to try to, pull the wool over their eyes. I think that's very simplistic. There's an enormous number of talented professionals in the public sector that know how to, they know how to structure and negotiate. I think what you want to make sure if you're in the public sector is that the right parties are assigned to this particular transaction and that they have the proper skill set or they hire good advisors to be able to match up with whomever the private sector is that they're negotiating. That's absolutely critical, that both sides have an understanding of what they need and what they're able to bring to the party.
Jeff, is there an example or two that you can sort of draw out a little bit of where it was a successful P3, yeah, and in part the public sector really came with the capacity and capabilities? And is there a P3 that you can pull sort of apart some where maybe the public sector and the private sector were misaligned? There wasn't a good mutual understanding. And as a result, the partnership got off to a rough start and maybe didn't deliver the value for both the public, but also for private shareholders.
Yeah, I'm going to light foot around that latter one because some of them may be my clients. So let me not delve into that one too much. I'll give you an example of one that is very, very old that did not work out as was intended. And it actually did not involve a significant amount of investment. I don't know, Dave, if you're aware of kind of the Atlanta water system management contract in the early 2000s. And again,
I was there when it was actually happening. That's a great one. Why don't you talk about it?
Well, and the city of Atlanta has been a long-time client. And again, both sides entered into this arrangement in the early 2000s just to bring a private sector entity on board to manage the water system. And in the best of all worlds, it would optimize the management, save money for the taxpayers and the users, and allow the system to be built up because it was under some significant federal mandates to improve its overall structure. Let's just say it did not work out as everybody wanted, and both sides have reasons to say, "Hey, you didn't live up to your end of the agreement." Whether it's the private side saying, "Boy, I didn't know that it was going to be this expensive," or whether it's the public side saying, "Hey, I thought you were supposed to invest more money in the capital side," is a good example, David, and you saw it, of just an agreement that did not work. And so the city of Atlanta called it off as the right thing to do from the city's standpoint, and they've been managing it ever since, and they manage it very effectively. So again, not every P3 is going to be, milk and honey here. Sometimes they don't work out, and sometimes you don't necessarily just say, "Boy, that was the person at fault. That side didn't do this, that, or the other thing. Sometimes just a combination of factors did not work out as people thought. Now, flipping around to to the other side of some examples where it appears as though it's going to work. A lot of these projects, Dave, as you indicated, are still new. They're still new, as in they've been in existence 10 years or so. On a 50-year agreement, that's still pretty new. There's 40 years that can work or not work. And most of these, particularly if they involve private sectors investing significant money, are 50-plus year arrangements. Because as you can well imagine, if you're the private sector and you're a private equity fund or you're an infrastructure fund, you need a while to make sure that you recoup your investment, particularly if there's a significant amount of money that you're investing. I think there are a couple to point out I'm going to point out two that are just dramatically different. And I was actually muddling around on ChatGPT just to see what it said about specific examples, and came up with a couple that I said, oh yeah, I forgot about that one. One is the Prince George's public school system. Prince George's is the largest, has the largest public school system in the state of Maryland. Very diverse county. I don't know if I'm not going to try your little trick, David, of asking for audience participation. You didn't do too well, but maybe
I failed on all those surveys.
Yeah, I know that didn't work out too well for you. I can't see the entire class, so I don't know if anybody here is from Prince George's County, but it's right outside of Washington, D.C. Anybody here from Prince George's?
Kind of. One student.
Okay, that's bad. That's not bad. Well, Prince George's public school system, one of the things that they set out to do, 10 years ago or so, is a significant amount of renovation, expansion, consolidation. And it was probably long overdue, as many public school systems are around the country, to kind of modernize the school stock, if you will. They decided that they were going to do it through a P3 arrangement. And somebody can say, "Oh, wait a minute. How do you own this? How does a private sector own a school?" Well, the private sector could be designing it, building it, financing it, operating it, and maintaining it. It doesn't mean that they are providing the education content, because they're not, but they are constructing, monitoring, maintaining the actual physical structures. So they have done a series of P3 transactions. I believe they're on their third, where they're kind of chunking them out 4, 5, 6 schools at a time. And then they do these contracts, which involve a private sector, investing money, but the private sector is responsible for providing the service that is agreed upon in the contract, i.e. a certain amount of schools. And in return, they get an availability payment, which is they get a guaranteed amount of money as long as they live up to their end of the bargain. And baked into that availability payment is the profit that the private sector gets. Appears that is a good working model. Again, appears. I'm not close enough to the action to tell you, boy, have there been some major slip-ups? I don't know, but it has been a series of transactions that seemingly is going to move forward. Hudson Yards. How many people are from New York City? Since we're on the hey, I see somebody in the first row.
Yeah, we got about 5 or 6 hands.
Okay, I'm sure the 5 people from New York City know where Hudson Yards is. For those that aren't, Hudson Yards is a major swath of real estate on the west side, kind of if you went directly west of Times Square, about 20 blocks south from where I'm sitting right now, you would run into Hudson Yards. And Hudson Yards, for a lot of my professional life, was kind of almost a quasi-wasteland of Manhattan. But the private sector and the public sector came together. Major Related is the company that led it. A major plan for renovating and building high-rises, office buildings, retail. And you may say, okay, well, what's the public sector's involvement? Well, there was a lot of tax abatements, and then the public sector's principal asset involvement was to expand the 7 line. So anybody who knows about New York City subways knows that the 7 line really runs across Manhattan, whereas most of the others run up and down Manhattan. But they needed to expand the 7 line so that they could transport more people on a more efficient and cost-effective basis over to that area. It's a good example of a public-private partnership where both sides had a need, both sides were willing to invest money, and both sides will get what they want out of the return, i.e. the private sector gets money and profit, in the best of all scenarios. The public sector obviously has an extended subway line. So those are two examples. And David, let me just point out one other kind of component of P3s that I didn't hear you mention, but I think was somewhat baked into a few of your lines there. And that is a lot of what people think of when they think of how is it that you kind of divide P3 projects. They refer to brownfield and greenfield. Brownfield being existing assets that are monetized in a P3 arrangement. And your Chicago parking meters is a brownfield. It's an excellent example of brownfield. Chicago Skyway, Indiana Toll Road, they were all existing assets that were monetized for some amount of money for some public purpose to use the monies that were received. Greenfield is a to-be-built P3. And often what people think of in that instance is social infrastructure or revenue-generating infrastructure. Revenue-generating infrastructure quite often being toll roads that have become very popular in certain states that have authorized them. Virginia, Georgia, Tennessee, Texas, Colorado. There are other states, but those, if you did a quick chat GBT, you will find a good amount of literature on massive toll road projects that have been built, operated, maintained, financed by the private sector under guidance and under a contract with the public sector.
And the state of Florida would probably be the poster child for it, right?
Yeah, yeah. Texas is where you just have an awful lot of them. They really, and having driven in Texas quite a bit over the last year or so, I can tell you they're just absolute beautiful toll roads. They're extraordinarily well maintained, and they charge you, but again, you're paying for the ease and for the execution, and they've executed very well. But there are a number of other states that are really jumping into this, particularly as they're trying to expand their infrastructure.
So Jeff, that's fantastic. I want to ask you one last question. So for the students in class, what would be a piece of advice you would give them about your field? Something about the field both attracted you early on, you've stayed there. I think maybe some of it might be around the complexity of both the public and the private sector, but maybe you could, what would be your piece of advice for the students?
Yeah, I mean, getting into this field, the first thing I would say is you have to understand why is it that you're interested in it. This is a speech that I always have with incoming analysts when they come in. If the reason you're getting into it is because you think it's a big paycheck, you like that idea, okay, I understand. It's not to say that shouldn't be one motivation. That won't keep you around very long. You've got to have a reason why you like the sector. And most people that enter into the public finance sector, they have a lot of appreciation for the public policy element of it. And David, you and I have talked about the fact that Maxwell graduates, many of them, most of them, hopefully most of them, already have a bent toward public policy. So you have one big check mark, and it means that you have an inherent interest in what we do, whether it's in the P3 area or the conventional public finance area. You have to maintain that interest. Now, that's not to say that you'll be able to be a successful public finance banker if you turn on the computer and you're jumping underneath your desk. That's not going to work either. So there's a lot of heavy finance associated with it, but you can't get by just being a finance geek. You've got to have a good public policy interest. So I would just tell people, do an honest self-assessment of what you like. Don't fool yourself, because it'll catch up to you in the private sector. If you're trying to fool yourself, at a certain point, you will get frustrated with it and it will not be what you want to do. But again, know who you are, do a self-assessment, and then pursue the areas that you think that you are good at, have an interest.
And Jeff, if I can, one of your strengths has been that you've been working across federal agencies, state and local agencies for a big portion of your career. Mm-hmm. And my own sense is that you go into those engagements not thinking, hey, I'm from Goldman, I'm here to tell you how to do it. But that part of it is, to what you said earlier, right? That the government does have capable people, right? And their interest in protecting the interests of their residents or citizens of their state or of the nation. And could you say just a little bit about, those building those kinds of relationships, that posture? Because I think that's what you were getting with, I think that's what you were getting at with the idea of you're not going to do this job remotely sitting at home in your pajamas.
That's a good point, and you're not going to do it sitting at home in my vest either. So there have been a lot of years spent building relationships, building trust, building value for each party. I don't think you stay in a business for 3 years, never mind 35 or 37 years, however long I've been in the business, if you don't like what you do and you don't like who you do it with. I have an enormous number of personal friends, professional friends that have been very, very active in this business for a long period of time. And if you don't look forward to meeting with them, talking to them, understanding who they are as individuals, not just as professionals, but as individuals, you're probably not going to be as successful as you could be if you take the time to invest in relationships. And I understand that AI is going to take over the world. I understand a whole bunch of things that will probably be far beyond my professional time period here. But there's always going to be a role for individual relationships when an individual has to select somebody to help them. As I tell people, this business can be complex. It can require an awful lot of thought work, but a lot of the transactions are ones that any number of hardworking professionals can do because it's a very competitive industry. At a certain level, a client is looking at you saying, I want you to take this sack of money. Yeah, that may sound crass. That's not crass. I want you to be the one to profit from the transaction that I am doing because I like you and I trust you. And I think you will do a very good job for us. And I think that it's because I know who you are and I know your company. So that requires time, and it requires putting in the effort to understand and to know people individually and to understand their problems and think about how is it that you find a solution for their problems. I mean, David, you mentioned earlier, and this is a good example for all P3s, when you really think about it and you think about, is a P3 applicable for a particular project? You have to think about, is that a problem in search of a solution, or is a solution in search of a problem? And you have to think about that every time you think about what is going to be your answer for what a client needs. Do you have the solution, or do you just have some baked in answer that you want to ram into that particular problem? And something you have to really give a lot of consideration for if you're going to be around for a long period of time.
Jeff, thank you so much. You have about 10 minutes that you
Of
would be
course.
able to take a question or two.
I'm more than willing.
Okay, questions. Yes. And if you want to just say what your name is, what year you are, and what you're majoring in, that would be great. And Professor Faulkner has a microphone for you to speak into. Thanks.
Well, mine was a little bit less of a question. I was just wanted to say, a family member of mine was part of the Atlanta water deal. She was the council or the general counsel for the city of Atlanta when they went and decided to split up and not go with it anymore because the system was it was way over budget for what they could have done or something. That's all.
So you were providing some clarification about the Atlanta.
A little bit. It was just I just didn't expect to hear that because I'm from Atlanta. So,
yeah, and maybe Jeff and I can both just add maybe a little bit more to that. Jeff, as I recall, part of the challenge for the city of Atlanta was they did not themselves have great financial capability at the time, and their bond rating was lower than they had hoped they'd be able to borrow in capital markets. But it's also that the infrastructure was in a much greater state of disrepair. And one of the challenges with Atlanta always is there are a lot of people who come into the city of Atlanta during the day to work, but then they leave and they go to the 26 county MSA around Atlanta in the afternoon. Was that part of the challenge, that the infrastructure, was both more undercapitalized than expected and that the city had some borrowing challenges?
I wouldn't say it had borrowing challenges, but what it had is and still does, like a number of other cities, there's an affordability issue. And so in the late 1990s, the city of Atlanta came under a significant EPA clean water mandate, and it was in the billions of dollars. And the Atlanta leadership at that time completely understood that if they had to finance all of that, and particularly if they had to finance it all in a short period of time, it was going to really strain the resources of the city. So what they ended up doing were two things, one of which still exists to this day, which was a brilliant move. And then and I'll talk about that in 1 second. And then they also entered into the arrangement with United Water for the private operation. That did not end up as well as they thought, because they thought that would be the cost-saving element. The brilliant move was that in 2004, and I actually did the first transaction which involved it, they put in place a municipal option tax, which they basically, as you just indicated, David, they charged a tax which was a sales tax on all things sold and or rented. When I say rented, hotel rooms, that sort of thing, in the city of Atlanta, that involved obviously users outside of just the residents of the city of Atlanta. So people that came in, bought their lunch because they're working downtown, people like me that flew into town, stayed in a hotel, had meetings, etc. All those monies were then dedicated to the water and sewer system, and have been hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars per year that otherwise would have to be assessed to the city of Atlanta residents as part of the user fees. And so this has been going on now for ever since 2004. So what are we, 22 years? And will continue to go on every 4 years. It's up for a vote. City of Atlanta residents know exactly what to do, and that is, yeah, let's tax other users because they are actually using the system, and they should not be using the system for free. They should be paying.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. I think we have one more question in the class, and then we're going to go to 2 more questions in the class, and then we have some online questions.
Okay.
Hi, Jeff. My name is Andrew. Thank you for coming on and talking today. I know you mentioned Hudson Yards. Do you know the vessel?
Do I know the vessel? You mean
It's like the
piece where people go up top?
Yeah.
Yeah. I know what you're saying. What is there something about the vessel?
I think he's remarking on the amazing design of it.
Ah, okay. Well, I can tell you guys one thing. I know nothing about design, so that's a guarantee.
Here's our next question, Jeff.
Hi, Jeff. Thank you for coming. My name is Alex Johnson. I'm a third-year student here at Syracuse. I study communications. But one of the questions I had, and kind of opening it up, I wanted to know and kind of ask if maybe the partnerships that I'm thinking of are qualified as P3s, or if there's something else you would qualify them as, how you would qualify them if they were maybe successful or not successful, and then maybe one follow-up question after that. So when I'm thinking of these public-private partnerships, one thing that came to mind was the FIFA and Olympic stadiums in these international countries. And I know some of the controversy behind them. I'm thinking, some of the stadiums built in some of the Gulf countries with maybe their public implications of like indentured servitude, or like some of the Gulf countries like Kuwait, maybe like less stringent labor laws. And I'm sure maybe and especially places like India, these can also be factors when maybe there's a risk to public in the way of workers, or also controversies maybe surrounding areas like the Olympics, or the patronage aspects where they don't actually seem to be, up to the standard of what these costs are. And then the implications, would you still kind of qualify these as successful partnerships, maybe based on kind of the profit model? What are some of those other factors and how they combine to understand if this was something that, is scalable or able to be done again, and how they kind of change internationally based on some of these other factors?
Yeah, I'm not going to comment on whether on graft and projects along those lines. I don't know enough about them. I know what you're referring to, but I would be making it up, and so I'm not going to do that. I would say, however, you asked what are some of the factors that have to be taken into account. Just broadly speaking, from a P3 perspective, it's not just how much money is made and whether a project is actually constructed and then opens up on time. There are obviously an enormous number of other factors that have to come into play by both the sponsor, and I'm referring to a sponsor being the governmental entity, and by the entity that may be investing and or part of the construction consortium. How is it that workers are treated? What type of preference is given to certain workers? I will tell you, in the United States, there are certain projects that are done that you can look, and the host municipality will say a certain percentage of the workers have to be residents of my particular city. Or if it's going to be a huge construction project and it's going to entail a large portion of the construction capability of an entity, you may have to have programs that are put in place for workforce development. And so there are any number of examples of municipal entities that have requirements other than just, I want the thing opened in 3 years and I want it to do X, Y, and Z. But they put requirements on it that make sure that the citizens of that particular city or state benefit from it, other than just the ability to go and go into whatever the stadium may be or whatever the public use may be.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Jeff, maybe I can offer you some of the questions online.
Sure.
One is a little bit like the one we just heard. How do you feel about sports arenas being part of these these partnerships? Do both parties benefit? Another is, how can you choose someone you trust and not violate government contract and acquisition regulations? And then finally, maybe let me ask you one more and you can offer kind of an integrated summation. When the private sector relies on infrastructure services from the public sector, what P3 structures or safeguards have helped ensure mutual benefit?
I'm not sure I can wrap 3 into 1, David, but that's a nice thought. Probably won't happen in my response. Safeguards. I think both parties have to have safeguards in the contract language. That may sound like a little bit of a chicken out in terms of my response, but the contracts are just enormously important. And so when I mentioned early on that the public sector, one of the things they have to do is they have to make sure that when they assign responsible professionals, that they are assigning professionals that either know exactly what needs to be done for this particular project, or know how to manage their private sector partners that they select, whether it's their advisors, whether it's their legal advisors, whether it's their construction consultants, that they have a sufficient number of consultants on board that know all the elements of the transaction to basically match up with the private sector. What you often see is that a municipal entity will hire what we refer to as their advisor. Their advisor is responsible for putting together the RFP, for talking to entities that are potentially interested, for winnowing down that list, whether it's through an RFQ and then an RFP, putting a lot of reliance on that advisor. And that advisor, how that advisor gets paid, you have to think about that. Should that advisor just be paid on a per hour basis? Should that advisor be paid based on success? Should it be paid based on the size of the transaction? There are any number of different ways to reward the private sector that really kind of align everybody's interest. And so the final agreement, when you actually have all the signatures done, and when let's just say it's in the case of the Long Beach Civic Center, which was a social infrastructure transaction, when that is open, that the entity that is going to be responsible for operating it, maintaining it, has every bit the incentive to make sure that it is operated as a spick and span asset in exactly the way that the public sector is looking for, because their payment or the amount of money that they get is contingent upon satisfying the contractual arrangements. The contractual arrangements, again, they really have to be structured so that everybody it's very clear. If you do X, then you get Y. If you don't do X, then you get Y minus something. You have to have an incentive to do it, and you have to have an incentive not to do it. Now, that may sound a little simplistic, but again, it has to come down to solid, understandable, non-debatable contractual obligations. Let me loop back to your question about sports arenas, because I've done a number of sports arenas and stadiums in my existence here. That is always going to, there are always going to be people that will say, and I'm not going to say they're right, I'm not going to say they're wrong, why are you giving money to billionaires? Okay, it's a very popular and understandable statement. And sometimes it comes in the context of, well, if you give that money, then you're taking it away from being able to build schools. Sometimes it's just not that simple. It could be a revenue source that the people that pay the revenue source will not authorize it to pay for schools. So it's not a revenue source you're taking away from schools. In some instances, it could be. And then you have to rely on, is the public sector actually getting value for the investment? More than just psychic value. Listen, I'm as big a sports fan as exists out there. And I love all my sports teams, etc. A sports fan always wants to see them able to spend as much money as possible to get the best players, right? Unequivocally. But there has to be a logic for a municipality saying, I need to build a new stadium or I need to renovate a stadium. Somewhere along the way, there has to be a credible belief that you are actually getting financial return, or that there's at least a break even there. And for some folks, I'm going to tell you, you can't talk them into that idea. There's no talking them into that idea. For others, they will believe it. They will say, yes, I believe it will work, and I'm a big fan, and I think we should go ahead. Those are really the two, completely, opposing sides of the kind of the arena and stadium debate. But you see it play out in so many different municipalities now because the costs have just risen dramatically. So it becomes much more apparent when Tennessee, for instance, is building a $2.2 billion football arena that will double for concert venue and that sort of thing. And the public sector puts in 1.2, the private sector puts in 1, the private sector operates it. That's a public-private partnership, folks. That it may not have that. It may not have some of those classic components that Professor Van Slyke outlined, but that's a public-private partnership because everybody's got skin in the game and everybody's got the incentive. So again, many different models, many different ways that you can view whether something should or shouldn't be done. But that's, there's going to be a debate around every single project, and it's not just sports arenas and stadiums.
Jeff, thank you so much for your time with us today. Really appreciate you being with us and sharing your expertise.
Of course. Thank you very much, folks. Appreciate the time.
And to all the students in the class and all our participants online, delighted to be with you today. Hope you have a great rest of your week.